I'm the chair and obviously welcome you all to this meeting. I particularly want to welcome as well two new members today. Maggie Harris down in the front here, who's joining us representing MASC, the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors, and Faye Middleton from the NES Teaching Union. So welcome to the meeting, and I hope you'll enjoy it. We've got a relatively straightforward agenda this morning. But one thing, I meant to say it last time, and it probably applies to me more than anybody, but now that I'm chair, I've sort of forgotten that. But I think when people are making contributions, if we can be fairly to the point, and really we're aiming more for questions as much as very long statements. I know you'll want to give some bits of information. And not that I want to stop discussion in any way, but I think sometimes with long deliberation, then people begin to tire. So we'll go to the agenda, and I'm going to make one switch, which we discussed in the pre-meeting. Number 4, agenda item 4, the schools partnership agreement. Councillor Martin Grogan, who's had to go to the dentist this morning, unfortunately. He was very much involved with that, and I know Mike Fowler from MASC as well was involved. He's not here. Martin will probably join us slightly later. So I'm actually going to switch number 4, and we'll take number 5, the revenue and capital monitoring outturn statement first, and discuss that if everybody's happy with that. Are people happy with that? Okay. We'll go now to the agenda. And point 1 now then, apologies for absence.
Good morning. Apologies for absence from County Councillor Louise Brown, from Mr Mike Fowler, and also possible apologies from... No, it's not possible apologies. Apologies for possible lateness from County Councillor Martin Grogan because of a dental appointment.
Thanks. Okay, thanks for that. And then we go to item 2, any declarations of interest. Councillor Maureen Powell.
Yeah, for declaration of interest, I'm a Governor of King Henry VIII Comprehensive, and it may come into conversation when we're discussing the budget, so I filled one in just in case. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm a Governor at Derryview Primary School, and therefore for the same reason that those words might slip into my mouth every now and again.
I'll declare an interest. I'm on the governing body of Ysgol Gymraeg Efenni in Abergavenny. Councillor Jones.
Good morning. I'd like to declare an interest, as I'm a governor as well, at the Ysgol Gymraeg Efenni and the Llanfihangel Criconi School currently, but the Federated School for September.
Councillor Harris.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, if we're declaring interest, I'm governor of Derryview Primary and Lentilip Primary.
Right, thanks very much. Other than that, obviously, I think we'll go over the normal as and when. If something arises which you feel you do have an interest, then obviously please declare it. I'd like now to, before we go right into the agenda, just for the benefit of people watching on YouTube, just to go around and introduce ourselves so that everybody knows who we are and what we're doing. As I say, I'm chair of CYP. I'm Tudor Thomas.
Councillor Laura Jones for Wisham, Deputy Chair of this committee.
Hazel Eilert, Scrutiny Manager.
Wendy Barnard, Democratic Services.
Tyrone Stokes, Finance Manager for Social Care and Health.
Kath Saunders, Governance Manager, Children and Young People Directorate.
Nikki Wellington, Finance Manager, Children and Young People's Directorate.
Maggie Harry, representative from MASC, Monmouthshire Association of School Governors.
Councillor Maureen Powell, Councillor for Castle Ward and Abergavenny, and a member of this meeting.
Maggie, can you turn your mic?
Councillor Jo Watkins, Caldecott Castle Ward, and a member of this committee.
Councillor David Jones, member of this committee and also a member for the Criconi ward in North Monmouthshire.
Pete Strong, National Education Union, non-voting member of the committee.
Faye Middleton, NASUWT, President of the Monmouthshire Association.
Councillor Roger Harris, Cresson Ward, Abergavenny, and observing this committee.
Councillor Reverend Malcolm Lane, a member of this committee, and Councillor for the Mardy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. If you miss me as well, obviously welcome our guests on the front table who will be presenting later on. Okay. Item agenda number 3, public open forum. I'm not aware of anything that's been sent to it. Okay, we're going to switch now then, as I say, instead of doing 4 next, we're going to do 5. So we're going to look at revenue and capital monitoring 218-219 outturn statement. And obviously, Nikki and colleague have come along to talk us through this and explain some of the more complicated bits. Thanks.
As I've said, my name is Tyrone Stokes. I'm the Finance Manager for Social Care and Health. I'll guide you through a general introduction to the outturn statement, but then I'll go into more specifics around children's services, this part of the directorate I work within, and then I'll hand over to my colleague, Nikki Wellington, who will talk you through the Children and Younger People's Directorate and the school individual budgets. If I start at page 57, and the purpose is to inform you of the revenue and capital outturn for the 2018-2019 financial year. If I draw your attention to the recommendations in section 2 on pages 57 and 58, more specifically to note 2.1, and overall the council had net revenue outturn surplus of £49,000. 2.3 then is to draw attention to the movements in individual budgets on school balances, and as I've explained, Nikki Wellington will talk you through that in more detail. And then 2.5 then is to note the enhanced monitoring around children's services and ALN. These are the ones that are the more highly volatile budget areas within this budget statement. If I look at section 3 on page 58, 3.1 details the revenue position for you. On page 59, right at the bottom, the 5th column across shows the £49,000 surplus. If I take you back up to page 58, for children's services, the forecast outturn was a £1.451 million overspend, and I'll go into that in slightly more detail for you. If I take you to page 67, 68 and 69, sorry about jumping around, it is quite a lengthy report, but I'm just taking you through the more salient points for you. Pages 67, 68 and 69 goes into more detail around the outturn position for children's services. Page 69. Oh, you don't, do you? No. Oh, I am really sorry. Thanks for pointing that out. Right. That's okay, no problem at all. If I go back to the points, if I look at point 3.2.5, 3.2.5 specifically looks at children's and younger people's. If I take it in sections, I'm just looking at the children's services element. So if you go down about another page and a half, down 3.2.5, and it'll be a statement. If I briefly read it out to you so you can catch up, children's services has experienced significant demand since month 7, resulting in an outturn overspend of £1.45 million, compared to the previous forecast in month 7 of £561,000 overspend. Legal costs overspent by £230,000. And we had looked after children numbers significantly increased. They went from 148 on the 1st of November, and they closed on the 31st of March 2019 at 172. That was a rise of 24 looked after children. That's just over 20% in just 5 months. That had a significant financial demand and pressure on the service. With that and the legal costs, more or less accounted for the £1.45 million overspend. 3.3.1 shows the budgeted savings that were part of the budget setting process. The Social Care and Health Directorate had targeted budgeted savings of £925,000, of which £147,000 was targeted at children's services, and that was looking at high cost placements and whether we could reduce the cost, of which the service achieved £145,000 of that targeted savings, which, against a backdrop of increasing demand and increasing children under pressure, I think that was a great achievement for the service to try and target those high cost placements and more or less make those targeted savings. For children's services, there are no capital schemes, and I'm happy to take questions either now or at the end. So is there any questions you want to ask specifically on children's services, or do you want to wait to the end and I can hand over to Nikki who can talk you through schools?
If people are happy, shall we take them at the end? Are people happy with that?
Okay, thanks
and
very
we'll
much.
take the two sections, obviously children's services and then the more Director of Education budget, but we'll take them separately at the end. I think that'll be clear.
Thanks very much. I'll just hand you over to Nikki Weldon and go through the schools and the Children and Younger People's Directorate budgets. Thanks.
Thank you, Tyrone. Thank you. So just moving back up then to 3.2.5, just to note that the Children and Young People's Directorate was 637,000 overspent at the end of the year. That was an increase of 308,000 from the month 7 forecast, which you will have seen earlier in the year. There were two reporting changes that added to the pressure within children and young people. 108,000 of that was for severance pay that was paid as one-off costs. Previously, that had been reported under Central, so it wasn't showing under our directorate, but at year end, we moved it over to our directorate. And there was provision for 49,000 in relation to redundancy costs. These were for staff that had been identified prior to the 31st of March. Therefore, we need to make the provision, even though those staff will not be physically leaving until the 31st of August. An audit adjustment requires us to make that provision in the accounts at the end of the year. The savings matrix, which is in 3.3.1, we had we achieved £475,000 worth of our savings. The total savings was 631 for the directorate, and details have been provided to you previously, but they are detailed in the report under 3.3.8 if you want to have a look at those. In terms of the overspend for children and young people, the main area was ALN. There was a shortfall of 278,000 in terms of recruitment income. That was both for mainstream and for Mountain House. There was an overspend of 212,000 for our outer counties and independent provisions. And there was an overspend of 251,000 for School Action Plus. So that's the support that we put into our schools to support pupils to remain in the mainstream schools. It's a familiar commentary there. You will have seen that we have been forecasting that as we went throughout the year. In addition to that, was a 78,000 overspend on our breakfast clubs. 50,000 of that related to a shortfall in income anticipated. As you're aware, we introduced a charge for non-free school meal pupils from the 1st of September last year, and 28,000 related to staffing costs. And it's a combination of additional staffing costs to attend the breakfast clubs, and some of those will have been staff to support children with one-to-one support who have to attend regardless of whether the child is there or not, because we don't, obviously there's no booking system in most cases and we wouldn't know whether the child would be there or not. Some of the savings that we've offset, we've had 133,000 in vacancy savings, and we had 57,000 in a late grant that we received from Welsh Government in terms of teachers' pay. I will confirm that we funded all of the teachers' pay for our schools, but in this instance the grant was more than the pressure for our schools, which was good news. Just very quickly on schools, on 3.7.10, the collective deficit for the year end is 232,000. We open with a surplus of 175,000. There's 15 schools in the deficit, and that's an increase of 3 since the beginning of the year. Again, all the details are provided at the bottom of the report, along with the respective recovery plans, which obviously we monitor very closely going forward, but I'm happy to take any comments on that. Finally, just very quickly, capital. You'll be aware that both our secondary schools in Monmouth and Caldecott are now open. Caldecott is near enough finished now, and we were reporting overspend on there of 739. Again, that's previously been reported to this committee. With Monmouth, there's still landscaping works and final bits and pieces to be done, and we are still predicting that there will be a overspend there of 346,000, although that wasn't shown in the 18-19 accounts. It will be shown in the 19-20 accounts, because obviously the completion of the works are in this current financial year, not last financial year. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, well, thanks for your inputs there, the two of you. Thank you, Tyrone and Nikki. Shall we start with the Children's Service budget then? And obviously that is the first one that we looked at. Are there any comments there that people would like to make?
It's a comment really rather than a question. Obviously, we've seen a significant increase in our LAC children, and that was a really high number to go up by in such a short time frame. So the fact that you've had an overspend is really completely understandable. I can't possibly imagine how you'd manage to do it otherwise. I know this is impossible, a question to ask, but is there any sense that you have that you're going to continue to see increases in the population of looked after children? I mean, do you think this is going to be an ongoing pressure and we actually need to make more substantial steps to try and address it, both budgetary, which is what this is all about, but also in terms of maybe our actions as a council?
We are seeing a LAC population increase. As at the end of June, the LAC numbers have gone from 172, where they were at the end of March, up to 182, and possibly rising. The service do some fantastic work. They do a lot of educate front of house, a lot of preventative work as well around it. But where those children have significant risks, we have a duty as a local authority to take remedial action. And the service are very good at trying to balance that risk in terms of, do they keep them out at arm's length and still have intervention, or do we have to then take the approach where we have to then bring them in as a specific LAC child? Looking across Gwent colleagues, Wales and nationally, this is a national trend. It was on the news last week. Unfortunately, BBC News only looked at England, but this is a trend right throughout England, where every single local authority is having a significant impact, budgetary and service demands on looked after children. From what I can see, talking to colleagues as well and looking at all data, this also happens in Wales as well and Scotland. So it's hard to answer your question on what we could do as either officers or members to try and influence that. The best we can ask members to do is to try and support us and also get that message across to Welsh Government as well. The significant pressures. We still looking at austerity as well. We are, out of 22 local authorities, we're always 22nd in the amount of funding that we get, because we're seen as more affluent. But the pressures, for example, children's services, adult services, other pressures on roads are no different to our local authority, to other local authorities as well. So you help in trying to support officers as well, trying to guide us in the right direction, and also having those conversations with Welsh Government around the funding streams that Welsh local authorities have, especially Monmouthshire, would be greatly received. But to put you at assurance, the service, I work very closely with the service, and they are looking at every alternative. They look at high-cost placements, look again and back in county. We've had a very successful fostering recruitment campaign where we're trying to increase our number of in-house foster carers, where we can go to those first. We're looking at SGO, special guardianship orders as well, whether we can look at those adoptive placements. We look at every single option open to us that's best to meet the child's needs and those of the local authority. But also we get a lot of pressure as well from the court as well. So some of those cases as well, we might see the local authority approach is different to that of the court. But once the court make that court order, unfortunately we have to follow that court order. But sorry, it's no good news what I can come to today and say at the end of June we've seen LAC numbers go down. Unfortunately, they have gone up. I was looking at data going back 5 years, 6 years ago, our LAC numbers were less than 100. Now, at 182, they're approaching the 200 mark. Looking at the average unit costs is between 40 and 50,000 pound a year to look after a looked after child, but that could range anything from as low as £7,000 to £8,000 on an SGO placement. We're up to possibly £500,000 with his out of county high cost school, residential, children's placement. Some children need possibly 3-to-1 support.
Okay, thanks. Any other points? And thanks for that very comprehensive response. Sorry. Councillor Powell.
Thank you, Chairman. Do you think that the increase in the numbers is an actual increase in the numbers, or is it that they're coming to light sooner? People are recognising these children, whereas in the past they might have been under the radar and not found, or do you think it is a trend to having more children that have difficulties?
It is a trend. If you look across Wales, you can see the graph is just going up and up and up. So it is a trend, I suppose. Society as well view vulnerable children slightly differently. Some of the high-profile cases as well make it more pertinent. But no, it is a trend that you can see. It's just not in Wales as well. It's national, where you can see is just going up and up and up. It's not like a small spike. It's going, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Anything else? Anyone? Councillor David Jones.
Could I ask about the breakfast club provision, in the sense that you said there's a reduced income and payment for staff to cover it? Has there been a change in the provision which means that people may be voting with their feet and not taking up the breakfast club offer?
In terms of the Breakfast Club, you'll be aware that we introduced a £1 charge for children that were not entitled to free school meals from the 1st of September last year. This is for the childcare element. So all children, regardless of whether they're entitled to free school meals or not, are entitled to attend breakfast and have a free breakfast. Traditionally, in most of our schools, the club will start 8:15, run for the childcare element for that first part, and then obviously children can then attend from 8:30 till 9, free of charge for the breakfast. Any child on free school meals can attend the whole hour or 3/4 of an hour or whatever and receive the whole of the childcare and the free school meal element for free. What we need to look at now, in some cases, there has been a reduction in the numbers that are attending the clubs. In speaking to our schools, in a small number of cases, it is in relation to low-income families, and we've got the evidence of that in a couple of our schools. But in some cases, it's a result of parents would have been dropping them off at 8:20 so they can get into work slightly earlier, 10 minutes earlier. Now what they're saying is we'll leave it till 8:30 because 10 minutes isn't going to make any difference to us, and we won't pay the £1 for that first part. In addition to that, some of our schools have introduced a booking system because they need to know the numbers. They've got limited space in their school halls. So in some cases, unfortunately, children that are not booked obviously can't then just attend because obviously they couldn't go into the club. What we're looking at this year is talking to the schools about where there has been a reduction in numbers, because we will need to look at the staffing ratios that we've got, and in some cases we are overstaffed in those provisions.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Jones. Any other issue? I assume we've finished on child services. Yeah. We look, obviously, Councillor Dave Jones has started the ball rolling on the sort of CYP budget. Councillor Maureen Powell.
Yes, now that we've sort of dealt for the time being with the looked after children, looking at the budget overall, I don't know what we can do about getting any more money from anywhere else, but the problems are in a good many places. Costs of everything has gone up. Cost of books, cost of teachers, cost of everything's gone up. Until our budget seems to stay the same, and we can only stretch it so far. And it seems unfair in a way that we're in this position. And I feel that I don't know whether it is when the money comes through from whether it's ring fence for education or whether we just get given a certain amount for education. And I think it would be interesting to know whether the education budget within the Welsh Government is ring fenced, because I think it's more important that some money should go to the children and young people in education than a lot of other things, but then that's my personal view. Because I know a lot of schools, particularly primary schools, they do a lot of fundraising to enable the extracurricular things, whereas in the past some of that might have come out of the budget. But I have declared an interest. I'm a governor of King Henry, but we, some of the governors and the parent teachers together, we're raising funds so that our sports teams can play away games, because you've got to pay for the transport, whereas that was provided years ago. And there are cases where, particularly in that big of any area, one area, there are a lot of the free school meals children whose parents can't afford to send them on school trips abroad, and it's unfair that they should miss out, and that fund is very privately, discretionarily given so that those children can get involved in everything. And this seems to be the only way that we can boost up the extracurricular items, because the budget is so tight. And I just don't know where the answer is. Will we have to start to raise funds to actually pay for our education before long if something doesn't happen? But I don't know what the answer is. I don't know if anybody has the answer.
It's not to look at the politics of it. If I just look at it simplistically, all local authorities, we know different. The largest amount of our funding comes from the revenue support grant that we get from Welsh Government. Looking at income generation, we try and generate as much income that we can ourselves. The director I work in adult services, because we can't charge for children's services, we max that out. Where yourselves as councillors can help is when the budget strategy comes before you as members. That's where you can have your significant input into that and where those funds go. The only downside for that is we only got an infinite amount of money, and it's got to be spread very thinly. It goes from schools, children's services, adult services, roads, bin collection, grass cutting. It's surprising how many services that a local authority's got to provide with that ever shrinking amount of money. So unless we get a significant cash injection, unfortunately there is no low-lying fruit. We took that years ago. We've got to make hard decisions around how we use our money, what services get funded, but whatever service you decide to fund or protect is at the detriment of something else, because there's no magic pot of money that we're holding on to. Reserves are low. We're looking to top them up because we've got to have a certain amount of reserves for a rainy day. So it is very difficult unless we get out of austerity and we see budgets start increasing rather than what we're having now, either flatlining or decreasing. Is difficult to try and exactly. And with council tax, we look at that as well, but then that's unpalatable because people don't want to pay anymore. So it's a difficult decision we all have to make, officers, and I appreciate you as members have to make that difficult when you're facing the public on why you've got to explain the 4 or 5% council tax increase. But a 4 or 5% council tax increase doesn't provide the amount of money we need, because, as I explained, the majority of our money comes from the revenue support grant. Is very difficult on our cash strapped, not only us, but all local authorities find themselves within.
Okay, thanks for that. Bringing Councillor Laura Jones on my left, you know.
Yes, I don't want to make it political. There are obviously political points to be made here, but one of the things that we're all affected by, as you've pointed out, is the fact that we're not getting a fair funding from the Welsh Assembly. It's not done on a basis that I think is just being distributed fairly between all the local authorities. So I'd agree with that. It's always Monmouthshire that loses out. We're seen as an affluent area and that's it, and we're not. We have severe pockets of deprivation. They're often overlooked. When I was a Welsh Assembly member, that's all I banged on about, is that the people people in Monmouthshire are losing out that don't have lots of money. Is often how we're seen. So I make a suggestion, Chair, that non-politically as possible, that we send a letter on behalf of the committee saying we have the increasing pressures, obviously increasing demands on us, and we can't. Obviously budgets are tight, and we need more money coming down from the Welsh Assembly. So please, can you re-look at the funding formula?
Just to add to that point, I think that's very welcomed, and I wouldn't have mentioned or suggested that if I didn't think we were operating as efficiently as possible. Like I say, we've already gone through the low-lying fruit, we've already looked at efficiency, we scrutinise unit costing. People like myself and Nikki every month, that's all we're looking at, is looking at the figures to see if we can make any small improvements, but that doesn't even touch the service now, because we only need a couple of children come in and just takes all those efficiencies away in one foul swoop.
Okay, it's not that I'm trying to stop discussion and bring people in now, but I think we've got to keep in mind as well, you know, what we can control in the sense of the budget. And in some ways I don't disagree with writing the Welsh Government, but at the end of the day, the biggest effect is going to be obviously within the budget strategy, which will come next February, of deciding, you know, where the council, you know, allocates resources. So I think in reality we've got to bear that in mind, and we've got to bear in mind that really we need to discuss the things that we can affect, rather than, you know, and I know, and it's a passion close to my heart, but rather than trying to discuss things that we can't really have an effect in. Councillor Maggie Harris.
Simply just want to sort of supplement what everyone's talking about, really, because even at national level, at Welsh Government, they're also strapped by what they get in. I don't know whether you feel that do you think we get singled out for particularly unfair treatment, or is it you do? Right. However, getting back for the general funding, austerity as a whole is really taking hold. I declare an interest because I'm a governor at Derry View, so our school is right in the middle of a very deprived area. So we've got double whammies going on. We've got high numbers of looked after children, deprivation, ALN pupils, etc., and therefore and a poor catchment area. So we're not able to raise money either. So sometimes a school like ours, or in an area like ours, we suffer even more. And once we were a community's first area, but Monmouthshire as a whole is not poor enough to substantiate us having that being continued. So, you know, sometimes you just worry that there are some children who will be disadvantaged by the whole of the funding system that we actually have in Monmouthshire, and that does concern me. But thank you, Chair.
Thanks. Sorry.
Just quickly say, particularly to Tyrion, we all know that the staff and the officers in this authority, one of the most efficient, it's known throughout Wales that Monmouthshire County Council is one of the most efficiently run, and I want to thank all the officers for all the work that they do.
Councillor.
Thank you. 3 points, if I may, on the paper in front of us. Follow up on the Breakfast Club. We've got obviously a shortfall of 78,000. Can you assure me that this money isn't actually going to be taken directly out of the schools pots, because otherwise they are going to be struggling, because as we can see from the rest of the paperwork, they haven't exactly flush with reserves at the moment. In relation to the ALN budget and the fact that there's been a noticeable overspend this year, I think we've discussed in the past how volatile that population can be and how the increasing pressures. Is it possible to get additional information for members to understand in more detail the breakdown of those costs in terms of future forecasting for budgets? Because frankly, we know that the ALM population isn't going down either, any more than the LAC population is going down. These are increasing numbers, and we will have to make budgetary decisions to look after those populations. We have no choice. They have to be looked after. So we do need to understand the actual financial implications and what we're going to have to pay for in the future. And then the last one is about, could you give me some explanation, please, about the fairer funding regulations between councils and governing bodies, which, according to the document, have traditionally precluded governing bodies from planning for a deficit position. We now know that it seems to be a regular habit of the Welsh Government to throw in some money right at the end of the financial year, and then we do a massive juggle. And try and all of a sudden squeeze a number of schools out of deficit. And are we allowing our schools to guess that they're going to get some money at the end of the year and stop them from making those awful decisions that they have to make at the beginning of the year, which normally, at this point, we know is staff? They've already cut everything else from the school budgets. There's no fat left in any of our school system. So what are we doing to actually allow for the possibility, but it seems to be a relatively reliable one, that money gets thrown into the pot next March?
Okay, if I take them in order, I might need a reminder at the end. In terms of the breakfast clubs, it is all centrally funding. None comes from schools, so the shortfall and the additional staffing is all taken centrally. There's no impact on schools whatsoever. In terms of the ALN budget, it comes at a very timely request, because actually we are starting to develop all of that data. We have a new manager of ALN. We have all of that data. We're starting to look at live birth data coming right the way through our flying starts, nurseries, etc., etc. So I'm sure if we put an agenda item, you know, for a future meeting, we can provide all that data and you'll be able to see the trends. What I will say is it's increasing, which we all know. The ALN bill, I'm not claiming to be an expert in any way or means, but I know that is going to place additional pressures on our services. In terms of the fair funding regulations, the fair funding regulations are very clear in what schools are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do, and same as what local authorities are allowed to do, etc. They do preclude schools from making setting a deficit budget when provided. Sorry, let me start that sentence again. They preclude an individual school setting a deficit budget if all schools are collectively in a deficit, which clearly they are at the moment. We've said that now. What we've done, we spoke with Cabinet, it's probably about 18 months, 2 years ago now, so we've just set that part aside for the moment. We are working with our schools. We met with all of our schools last Thursday. We've reinforced what the recovery plan process is with our schools so that they understand what the recovery plan process is and the time allowed to recover. It is difficult because it is a fine balance between providing for the children and standards and having the money there. When we talk about grants, we haven't seen the level of revenue grants come through this year. We've seen capital grants, which obviously is very limited in their use, that they come through. In terms of revenue grants, we haven't seen those come through, which has obviously not helped with the situation with school balances. We can't allow schools to anticipate at the beginning of the year, I might get an extra £10,000 at the end of the year, because they might not. So, you know, we work with our schools throughout the year to plan with the information that we have at the time. And in some cases, yes, that will mean that staff have to be made redundant, but it's done with the best knowledge at the time, and at any point that decision, should money come into the system, be rescinded.
Okay, thanks. Peter, did you want to? No, not going to come in. Anybody else want to come in on the budget? Welcome, Councillor Martin Grogan. Now, we hope he's not too sore after his dental. We've swapped the agenda items, Martin, so that we wanted you to be here for the partnership agreement. So we're actually doing we did finance first with that in mind. But welcome to the meeting. Any other points now that you want to raise on either of those budgets, the sort of children's services or CYP?
Just for clarity, are we taking up Councillor Jones's suggestion of writing to Welsh Government, or are we not?
I've got to be honest, consulting with the scrutiny officer, this is something we've done frequently before, and really to no effect. And I'm sure, you know, every other 21 authorities in Wales is going to be writing the same letter, but without huge effect.
Yeah, just to comment on that, from a meeting that I attended that Kirsty Williams spoke at, she is amenable in principle to looking again at the funding formula. However, her view is that that is much better done at a time when there's a degree of expansion in budgets, because if you do it at a time when there are cuts in budgets, that is extremely disruptive to those authorities that are going to have absolute cuts in their funding. It's better to even it out as things are going up, which seems to be a reasonably fair way of going about things. I mean, we can argue about whether Monmouthshire is dealt with fairly or not, but that would involve a long political discussion, and I've been holding back because I you know, if you want it, I'm happy to indulge in it, but I gather it's not appropriate.
Councillor Roger Harris, no, we won't go into the long political, because obviously scrutiny is not, in that sense, political.
Thank you, Chair, for letting me in. Unfortunately, the word political has been mentioned. If we're talking about writing to the Welsh Government, we should also be writing to the British Government in Westminster saying we've had 9 years of austerity, which must have affected the budget that we in Wales receive. And we're not happy down in Wales with the amount of money that's coming into Monmouthshire. Are they happy up in Westminster that we're getting a fair deal?
I think we need to make a decision. Thanks, Councillor Harris. It's a valid point. Without getting into the political sort of issues, we need to decide. My own sort of gut feeling, so speaking to the scrutiny officer, my gut feeling is I don't honestly think it's going to achieve much. Yes, we can write a letter. We could write to Westminster as well. But I don't honestly feel it's going to have any immediate effect. Yeah, hang on. So, you know, I'm going to suggest that we don't write that. That is my feeling, because I don't honestly think it will achieve a great deal, and I think we might then break down into sort of political lines, which is not useful in this meeting. So unless somebody is shouting, large number is shouting at me, I don't think we're going to move on that. Are you happy now then for me to sum up in terms of the discussions before we have any other points? From my understanding, and obviously I thank the presenters very much for coming here today and providing such a comprehensive report. Certainly kept most of us occupied, I would think, for the last day or so, but it's been clarified now, and thanks. Thanks very much. In terms of the children's services budget, and I'm vice chair of corporate parenting, and I see things there at first hand, and I can understand, as Tyrone has explained, there is a volatility there, which honestly we cannot really control. And I think obviously we have a statutory obligation, but we have a moral obligation to look after those children if they fall into certain circumstances. And quite honestly, I can't think that we can do anything other than, as it were, as an authority, top that budget up. When it comes to it, we can't say, well, we're not going to look after 10 children who come into the authority. And, you know, I think it is as it is, and the choice is yeah, there is no choice, and in fact the numbers of cared for children, corporate parenting children, is going up in England, it's going up in Wales, and we could have a discussion about how society is changing, etc. But that is it, and I take Maureen Powell's point that perhaps we're better at sort of picking up on this and in a sense sort of diagnosing the problem and stepping in and intervening, which we need to do. So I think we've got to live with that, and it is a huge deficit which we've got there. I can't honestly see there's any easy way around that, and that's something that will come up in the budget. Going to the CYP budget, it's more controversial, and we could all get into a political punch-up in the chamber this morning. But there is obviously, I've picked up today the concern that we've got 15 schools in deficit, budgetary deficit, primary schools. We've got 3 out of the 4 secondary schools in deficit. We've only got 4. And one school's got a very large deficit. And I think there is a general concern about that. And in reality, I think in terms of the school deficits, we can split the cake however, which way we want. But if the cake doesn't increase, then it's not going to significantly change. I know there are moves afoot to look at premises and cleaning costs, etc., but then that will cut down on teaching budgets. In reality, I think we need to note our concern, and also that we raise this when we get to the budgetary decision-making period, starting immediately after Christmas, because this problem is not going away. And I know that people, I'm a governor in the Welsh School in Abergavenny, other people are governors, we tend to think of our own parochial little patch, but in reality, we've got to look at the broad picture. And that's what I'm trying to do now in my new role of going to schools across the authority, just to see how things are working out. So I think it's general concern. It's up to us, and obviously within our political groups, to be working in terms of the actual budget when we get to that in January and February. Are people happy with that summing up? Is that a reasonable assessment? Okay. Well, thank you very much, for your inputs there. Very much welcomed. And thanks for answering all our questions so comprehensively. Thank you very much. We'll move on now. Sorry, we held that back because Councillor Martin Grogan couldn't be with us at the start of the meeting. He's obviously joined us now. And we're going to go back to item agenda 4, which is the Maintain Schools partnership agreement. And Kath Saunders now is going to take us through that first before we open up for discussion. Over to you, Kath. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. Members will recall that this partnership agreement came before them in January. The purpose of the agreement is to provide a legal and formal basis for a partnership between the local authority and schools, school governing bodies, and it makes clear the roles of the governing bodies and the schools and how they should discharge their functions in line with the relevant legislation. When the document came in January, we were asked to go away and to relook at it, to relook at some of the language around that was included in the partnership agreement, to sort of make the agreement slightly smaller, and to look at some other partnership agreements from other local authorities. In particular, Monmouthshire Association School Governors were not happy with the document. However, the recommendation from the meeting was that we met with the Monmouthshire Association School Governors, with Councillor Grocott chairing the meeting, and we discussed changes that they felt they would like, which we've taken on board. We've rewritten the document, taken on board those changes, and we're bringing it back now for further scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, back in January, there was considerable disquiet among some members of the Monmouthshire Association of School Governors. And the issue in essence was that the document appeared to be asking almost too much of governors and actually setting out in quite legal terms things that on a day-to-day basis are actually undertaken by head teachers and members of senior leadership teams in schools. And so we decided at that point back in January, when I was still chairing this committee, that we would meet with the Association of School Governors. And I have to say it was a very constructive meeting. And I could understand, as a school governor, where school governors were coming from. Because on a day-to-day level, I'm sure you will all agree with me here, those of you on governing bodies, we go into schools and we're reliant on information that we're given. And we're given that in good faith. And so we held a meeting, we looked very carefully at the wording. And of course there are difficulties because there has been a statutory duty to produce a document such as this since 2007. We are now in 2019. The best things are worth waiting for. But this is the first time, to my understanding, that Monmouthshire have actually produced a document like this. Kath Saunders has put a lot of work into it. Having listened carefully to MASG, I think the wording now takes into account that when we talk about schools, in law, governing bodies have got statutory duties, but it now acknowledges that they receive advice from senior leaders. So I think it was a nice example, although I can understand Ms Saunders' frustration at it. It was a nice example of two sides being able to come together to talk it through. In terms of the actual document as it now exists, I would commend it to you. Ms Saunders has done an awful lot of work on it. I checked it over, which is the easy bit to do. But I think it now does meet the concerns of governors, and I would certainly now commend it to this committee. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Grocott, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for all of your input into this document. I know Mike Fowler was also involved, who's unfortunately not here today, but thank you very much for that. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you. Any further comments, suggestions from members? Councillor Maggie Hardy, sorry.
A few words on behalf of MASG. We so appreciated the input that was actually taking place, because at the end of the day, we are not the experts. We are willing, we are volunteers, we're everything. And we did appreciate the amount of work and the interaction that's gone on. So thank you very much for the revamped document. I'm the Johnny-come-lately because Leanne did all the hard work and I'm just coming in on the back of it. But it does read in a much more user-friendly way for people who do not do a full-time job, but who do their job willingly as best they can. And thank you very much for your efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie Harris, for that. My understanding now, and obviously I wasn't involved in as it were, the MASG negotiations and the suggestions, but it appears to me now, to sum up, that everybody is happy now with this document. Suggestions have been taken on board, and as Councillor Grocott rightly said, it's the right way for something to happen, that there is discussion and negotiation, and obviously a much better document has emerged, which is clearer and outlines responsibilities of governors and of head teachers within the school context, and obviously of the local authority. If we're happy with this, and looking around, are people now happy with the document as it stands? I see nodding of heads. I would take that as assent. Sorry. Elizabeth Thomas, yes.
Thank you, Chair. There are just a couple of minor technical changes. I think partly it's because of the pace of change with Welsh Government's education reform journey. Things like the Level 2 Plus is included as part of the data. It probably needs to be the CAP 9 now. There are a couple of sort of recent technical changes that perhaps I could email to Kath, if that would be all right. I mean, the tone of the document is excellent, I think, and it's clear there's been a lot of hard work put into it. It's just there are a couple of things that, if we're going to future-proof it for 3 years, I think possibly need to be changed, but they're very minor.
Thank you, Elizabeth Thomas, for that. If you're happy to email Kath with any suggested changes, the ones that you've outlined, and obviously documents change almost on a daily basis, unfortunately. If you're happy to do that, and I will ask Kath then obviously to incorporate those minor changes before the document actually goes out to schools and to heads and governing bodies. It'll obviously go to Cabinet first, so obviously we've got a little bit of time. Personally, I think the challenge is going to be obviously disseminating this information to all the governing bodies and ensuring that governing bodies are crystal clear about their responsibilities. And I know, looking around a number of governors here, that we take our duty seriously, and I'm sure most do, but there is quite a large amount of documentation to take on board, and this is quite a weighty document when you go through it. So I think there's some work to be done there, and I think perhaps there might need to be some training sessions, in a sense, or some general sessions within school governing bodies to actually be taken through the document so that people are absolutely clear what it actually entails. So I think that's something we need to perhaps log and think about for the future. But other than that, thank you very much for your work. As I say, thanks to Councillor Grogut and Mike Fowler, who's not here, for their input, and we'll accept that document and go forward with it. Okay, we're going to have a little swap around of the agenda today, because obviously Will McLean, the Senior Officer for CYP, has just joined us now. He's come hot foot out of senior management. He looks fairly cool about it. So rather than going on now to confirm minutes, etc., and some of the actions, I want to just jump on a little bit and go to item 8 and look at Children and Young People Select Committee Forward Work Plan. And I did mention earlier on in the pre-meeting, well, that you and I and Jane Rogers did have a discussion about bringing topics forward, on a slightly broader front at some point. I don't know if we've actually got to that yet, have we? But it's in train. But I'll hand over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People, Monmouthshire. Thank you, Chair, and it's been really useful over the last couple of weeks to be able to spend a bit of time with both yourself and with Jane Rogers, Head of Children's Services, to think about the forthcoming agenda for this CYP Select Committee. There was a number of areas that we wanted to work with the Select Committee on, I think raising both awareness and kind of covering off some of the activities that are happening that we think it would be useful for Select Committee to be aware of. The areas that we covered off were specifically some areas around additional learning needs, and allowing, given that the extent of the work that's ongoing in the county at the moment in terms of how we address those additional learning needs, the new legislation that has been enacted and the code of practice that will be introduced at the beginning of next year. It would be really useful for this committee to be very aware of those kind of those changes in responsibilities, because they will be significant in terms of the removal of statements, the introduction of individual development plans, the fact that IDPs, as they will be known, fall both to the school, and those more significant IDPs fall to the local authority, how that will work. and how we will understand that and work with our schools. So I think that ALN transformation piece is something that absolutely should come to this committee. It would also be really good for the committee to receive updates from the regional lead. So there are 4 regional leads across Wales employed by Welsh Government. They are, in our region, it's Tracy Peed. She works to Dermot, who's the lead director for ALN, and the director in Torfaen. I think it'd be excellent for Tracy to come and present, because she has such a clear oversight of what's happening. We've also undertaken readiness assessments in all of our schools to make sure that we are as prepared as we can be for that future. Allied to that ALN transformation, there is ongoing transformation. It's very much the word of the moment, feeding through the health boards and the regional partnership boards, which are the statutory bodies established under the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. There is significant funding through the Intermediate Care Fund and the transformation funding, particularly looking at how we support children with mental health and wellbeing needs. That work is being led regionally by Dr. Luke Jones, who's a clinical psychologist. Luke works exceptionally closely with Monmouthshire. He sits on our Strategic Children and Young People's Partnership. And I think, again, that would be a really good area for Luke to come and advise you about what's happening and for you to scrutinise that work and to take assurances that, that Monmouthshire is leveraging in as much as it can into its schools and other settings to make the impact for children and young people. Allied, I guess, to both children's mental health and additional learning needs, one of the areas of work that we see as a key challenge for us, and it was identified in my Chief Officer's report, was around inclusion in schools. There are different practices in our 4 schools, which mean that there can be a range of exclusions. I mean, both in primary school and in secondary school. So I think actually in the autumn term, I'm expecting a behaviour policy for the whole authority to be developed and finalised. Again, I think that's something which would be useful to bring here. I think that range of practice is something that the committee would be interested in. We range from having, a very, very well-developed restorative and relational approach in Monmouth Comprehensive to more traditional behaviour management practices elsewhere. Now, that's not a judgment as to which is more successful, but they are different approaches, and I think it would be interesting to see those set out for committee colleagues. Beyond those kind of large transformational areas, there are a number of ongoing areas of, I guess, as we would see in our departmental management teams, areas of risk that this committee will want to be assured about. Clearly, the financial position that we find ourselves in remains challenging. I know Nikki's presented year end to you this morning. We'll be moving into year 2. Sorry, not year 2, month 2. Gosh, it's, yes. It's that type of day, to month 2, month 7 reporting. So I think that's really important that we retain that as an ongoing focus for your work. Through the School Finance Forum, we're looking at ways in which we can be more effective and more efficient. So that work is ongoing somewhere else, and I hope that that would be fed through into those monitoring reports for you. Beyond that, there are ongoing pieces of work, the 2-year delivery plan for children's services, the reform of that service and how that works is something that Jane and I have discussed, and clearly that's going to be really important that that comes back to you so that the committee retains that balance between children's social services and the educational side of things. I think one of the key aspects for that, I think, is understanding what they're doing in terms of a practice and a contextual piece, but really understanding some of the significant drivers that are impacting on both children, social services as a service, but the consequential impact they have on schools, that I would see that. We have seen the number of looked after children increase significantly in the recent past. So I think we are currently at about 178 or maybe 176. And traditionally we've been at around 100. So there is clearly significant shift there. That does have an impact on the whole system. There are significant cost pressures at the acute end. Finding the right services for those children at the acute end is a challenge, but those children are also need support and development within the school setting. So I think that one is an overarching one which reaches across. And then, of course, there are the annual reports. Mine and Julie's as Director of Social Services both normally come to the relevant select committees. And we want to report some of the aspects of the corporate parenting, such as, you know, the notion of the virtual school for all of our children who are looked after and so on. And we want to make that available to a broader audience. And this committee seems like an ideal opportunity to do that. So those were the kind of the broad areas that Jane and I discussed, largely around the transformation areas around ALN and around the ICF led by the Health Board. But then also kind of making sure we break those down into an understandable pieces around what impact they have on our services, both children's social services and education. I'll be happy to take any questions. Well, I was going to propose that Jane and I work with Hazel to actually put those into the diary for the future, so we're all very clear about where they are.
Thanks, Will, for that. Very, very comprehensive. And I welcome the meeting with Will and Jane. So they obviously got very busy schedules. Some of the things that I sort of thrown up as well, which are not on the list, sort of new areas. I intend, with the Vice Chair, Councillor Laura Jones here, to go to Chepstow Comp to discuss and then report back to CYP on the free school meal performance. Because that is an issue that has really sort of challenged us and we're concerned about. I'm trying now to get to visit some of the schools. I've been to one in Caldegot, no surprise, Ysgol y Ffin, the Welsh medium one down in Caldegot, but I will be going to across the range in schools. In terms of Mountain House, I wonder whether perhaps that comes to the scrutiny committee first in September before it goes to cabinet. I don't know whether that is sort of viable. Chepstow comprehensive, the issues of those numerous buses passing Chepstow and going on to Wydeen really does concern me. And if I were a teacher and head and management team and governing body in Chepstow, it would, I'm sure it challenges them. And I'd really like to look at that to see if is there something or strategies that we can employ to keep those children within MCC. My view very strongly is if you, as a child, attend a primary school in Monmouthshire, then hopefully you should go to secondary school in Monmouthshire, not cross the border and go into a school in England. The other issue on the sort of education front is the Welsh medium education issue. There's a new Welsh education strategic plan. I went to a meeting in Pontypridd last week. It's now going to be a 10-year plan, and it's going to have a different focus. And that will have an effect. And it will certainly have an effect in every authority in Wales. So that's something I think we need to look at and to get our minds around it. And the final bit on Welsh medium is obviously, I think, the update on the proposed new school, which has been funded by Welsh Government in Monmouth. I think we need to look at that because that's certainly got an implication for Welsh medium within the authority. On sort of non-education issues, some of the things I discussed with Jane and Will, and it's on, I think it's on your sheet, the support for foster carers, the sort of edge of care team and base and bringing in foster carers. I think it would be good for us to actually look at that. Yeah. I think, and I speak as somebody who's getting older, like everybody every year, but I'm further along the line, I think, the engagement with the Youth Forum, in terms of finding out what their priorities and concerns are. I went to a youth engagement, a care leaver rather, engagement evening with Child Services 2 months ago, and it was so good to actually listen to young people about what they thought of the care leaver situation, not what we thought as corporate parents the situation was. And I think that's very important. It's quite difficult for somebody in my age to imagine, what it's like at the other end of the spectrum at 16, 17. Young carer strategy update, and also then looking at childcare and the childcare sufficiency, let's look at sort of you know, an update on that, and possibly things like well-being reporting, thinking of the Well-being and Future Generations Act, things like obesity, eating disorders, etc. I think at some point, if time allows, we should perhaps touch on that. And you know, that's quite a lot, but it's not something we're going to get done in 1 or 2 meetings. But I think it will broaden our base. So obviously now welcome questions to Will. Will wants to come back.
Thank you, Chair. Just before Councillor Groker comes in, just one point for the committee with regards to the reporting of examination results this summer. There is significant change and there have been, EAS have presented to this committee about this. So there will no longer be aggregation of school outcomes to a county level. That will no longer be made available through the core data set. So there will be a significant change in the way that we report those aspects and issues to this committee. And we will want to stay on the right side of that. That's definitely part of the direction of travel, the removal of, as they refer to it, high stakes accountability. So we will have to, through the chair, we will think very carefully about how we present the outcomes of the summer. The days of the press release on that Thursday morning in August, detailing what every school did, finding the good and the bad in each, or finding the good and hiding the bad, I suspect is probably a little closer to the truth. No, sorry, in jest, obviously. But that will be a thing of the past. So this year, certainly, the press release on the day will be congratulatory to all learners. But there will not be that detail within it. So how we think about how we feed that back into this committee will be something important. And in the future, it looks as though the developments will be away from any nationally set targets and accountability measures, and that each secondary school certainly will select at Key Stage 4, which is the area which garners most focus, 6 independent targets that they will derive from their school development plan and self-evaluation processes. So this is a significant shift about how we think about where our schools are performing. So we will continue to work with you, with our colleagues in the AS, to make sure you understand and can engage in that system, so that you have, I guess the key things are, you have assurance about the quality of the evaluation and the planning processes in the school, and then you have confidence that they are prioritising the right things from there. That was all on that.
Councillor Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome that statement by Mr McLean, particularly the element about looking at issues around young people's mental health. We talk about an elephant in the room, but I think there's a herd of elephants in the room when we come to issues around behaviour. And I think I've made the point here before that in England, people now refer to emotional and behaviour difficulties as social, emotional and mental health disability. In the context of Mountain House, there is a whole population of youngsters there with social, emotional and mental health issues. And in the context of planning to potentially close that school, and obviously we're not prejudging anything at the moment, but we need to be kept abreast of what is going to happen to these young people in their local schools if Mountain House is to close. And I know that's something that you've referred to many times yourself, Chair. I think we need to ensure that there is a very clear plan for dealing with that population. There is then, I think, the increasing need to liaise closely with colleagues in the Health Authority. And I would ask Mr McLean if he sees better collaboration with organisations such as CAMS, who I understand are under huge financial difficulties themselves. But since I joined this council, people have talked about the Public Service Board bringing together representatives from right across the public service. And every time people ask, well, where are the outcomes? We keep being told it's in the planning phase. Well, when does planning actually start to lead to outcomes? I'm concerned about the rising number of exclusions in both primary and secondary schools, and I would ask that the issues that are brought to this committee could include those, because I think there is evidence that the number of exclusions among youngsters who are looked after who qualify for free school meals are higher than in the rest of the school population. And this is why I talk about a herd of elephants in the room. When it's great for Mr. McLean to come and talk to us about mental health issues, but will he also relate to us these major issues around the increasing numbers of youngsters in our schools with extremely challenging behaviour linked to mental health issues, and what the strategy of the authority will be, links with mental health and adolescent services, children and adolescent services in the health authority, and what's happening in our schools in terms of exclusions, where young people who are disadvantaged are at a higher risk of being excluded than the general population in schools.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Grover. Come back to Will now to answer that. And I've got another point as well with Will, but answer this.
Yeah, okay, fine. As I said in my opening statement, you know, exclusions is an area I think needs to come in front of you. Absolutely agree with that. I think exclusions, you know, when you look at the numbers, they are high. You know, I'm not going to turn away from that at all. I think the way in which we take some of our decisions has an impact on that. So we would rather take the time through fixed term exclusions to find the right provision for young people rather than permanently exclude them. So there are swings and roundabouts and there are compensations and so on. So, but we will bring all of those numbers back to you. I think we need to be really clear about the fact that a mental health challenge for a young person is not the same as a child with SEBD, and they are different things. I get the English nomenclature, but they are slightly different things. More than happy to come here with Luke if he's available. I think he's the lead transformation lead. Clearly, CAMS is under a huge amount of pressure, and the number of times as chief officer that you hear about what I would absolutely consider to be an extreme event in a young child's life, and then there is a significant waiting list or a waiting time to get into CAMS, I find that astonishing. Clearly, they are professionals who form judgments about clinical risk, and that's absolutely right. The point for us is understanding with colleagues such as Charlotte Jury, who works in children's services, is how do we kind of those transitionary points between mainstream population, those children who engage in face-to-face counselling, those who need something more significant than face-to-face but don't reach those kind of critical levels in the CAMS. The whole piece around CAMS is under significant change at the moment as they move away from a highly medical model of intervention, the one which I suspect certainly I'm used to in terms of an escalation and the requirement to escalate to medical professionals, to one which is to premise to a far greater extent on early intervention by a much broader range of professionals. So I think certainly if we think about how we schedule and arrange those presentations to this committee, an early presentation from Luke I think would be really valuable, because I think that would set the context and understanding for those future parts that come through. But absolutely, we will certainly do that.
Okay, thanks, Will, and thanks, Councillor Grover, for raising those issues. I totally agree, particularly the issue of exclusion, and particularly exclusion, if that's starting at primary, sort of junior level, that doesn't bode well for the future when those youngsters go through into secondary and probably go on into further sort of concerns. Can I just backtrack a little bit for one moment and go back to Mountain House? I think certainly my feeling, and the local member can't attend today, she's had to go to a SACRE meeting in Newport, Councillor Louise Brown, but in reality, I think there's a strong feeling, I feel strongly that the issue of Mountain House should come to CYP in September 1st before it goes to, finally to Cabinet, and I don't know, is that possible? Am I right in feeling that it's a wish of this committee that it comes here first before it goes to Cabinet. I'd welcome views on that.
Yeah, so in terms of the timing, and I spoke to some of the trade union members yesterday at our JAG meeting. The timing at the moment suggests that there will be a special Cabinet meeting in mid-September to consider the future of the proposals that come out of the consultation with regards to Mountain House. The issue being that if we went to the early Cabinet meeting in September, then the papers and so on would be released whilst members of staff were not in school. We didn't think that was appropriate. So we wanted to do that in a way that we were able to speak to members of staff, governing body, etc., and take that to the plan is, I think, the 18th of February. 18th February, September, sorry. That, I think you have a meeting on the 17th of September. So it could potentially come here before it goes to Cabinet. The papers will be released almost simultaneously then between Cabinet and Select. That's where we are in terms of the timings. And that we're working through the papers at the moment and establishing the recommendations that we will make to Cabinet. I'm not clearly in a position to disclose or discuss those with committee today. I suspect, that there is further opportunity, whatever decision that Cabinet make, there is a statutory publication of notices. During that notification of publication of notices, there are the opportunities to respond to the publication, to object, if that's the position we find ourselves in. So it's not the end of the process, I think would be what I would stress to committee today. Whether we decide to bring it on the 17th and then orally update Cabinet on the 18th is something we could think about. But I'll work with Chair and the executive member about how we structure that through.
I think the difficulty is looking at the dates. Obviously, CYP is scheduled on the 17th of September. And Will, you said the Cabinet looking at it on the 18th, which is literally the day after. Can I just gauge the feeling of the meeting? Would people like it to come to CYP, if possible, before Cabinet? That's an important point, I think. Anybody who have thoughts on that?
I think I would, provided that we're going to be issued with information that we don't have now in terms of some papers. Because at the moment, I'm wondering what there is new to discuss, other than things that are perhaps not yet been issued to us.
Yeah, of course. The papers for Cabinet will probably be released on the same day as the papers for that Select Committee. So that will have the recommendation that officers make to Cabinet following the consultation process. So that will have in it the recommendation whether we suggest that the Cabinet go ahead and issue statutory notices and publish those, or not to do that. So that will be, and that's the very place we are. Clearly, we're not in a position to share that at the moment, but at that point in time, we will be, absolutely.
So are you suggesting, Will, that we could look at it in CYP, look at Mountain House on the 17th, because the papers we'd have extra information then, and it's going to Cabinet on the 18th. But, I want to discuss it if there's a point in discussing it. There's no point us going around the houses again without any extra information, in my opinion, because I don't think that's worthwhile in a sense for them or in a sense for the committee. But obviously, it's a major issue for CYP, losing the only special school provision within the authority. It's a big move, isn't it? And this committee needs to be have an input to that, in my opinion. Shoot me down if I'm taking the wrong line there.
So if I could just come back for clarity. So the papers for the special Cabinet, if that goes ahead on the 18th of September, would be published on the 10th of September. So there will be in the public domain the recommendation that Cabinet will discuss. If it were to come to this committee on the 17th, there would be an opportunity for officers to present to you that report and for you to express a view as to what you think of that report. My point is that we would have to update Cabinet verbally the next day. There wouldn't be an opportunity for you to write or anything else. It would simply have to be that officers do that. I think the other thing just to note is just in terms of the scope and at that moment, the opportunity for this committee to have an impact or affect the decision that Cabinet makes is the other piece. So as I have done throughout the whole period of time around Mountain House, I've always come to this committee and provided you with a briefing. We did it in committee last time and in closed session. I'd be more than happy to do that again. I think probably it's worthwhile myself, Hazel and the Chair having a conversation about what actually, in terms of the decision making and in terms of potential objections to that decision making process, what value it coming here would have.
Two things come to mind, I think. Either we go, as Will suggested there, we meet on the 17th. The papers have been released on the 10th of September, and they're in the public domain, so we've got more information. But then we've got that, but following immediately on from that on the 18th, and then there's only time to give a verbal update to Cabinet. Is it going to have that much effect? So in my mind, either we go for that, or we look at a date after the 10th of September where we meet purely to look at Mountain House. And that is the only item on the... Yeah, I'd like to gauge the feeling of the committee. Do you think that is worthwhile? Because I'm well aware of time, etc. But on the other hand, it is a very important issue. So I'd welcome views now as to what people think. Do we go for a meeting after the 10th? Or do we go for the 17th and the verbal update to Cabinet on the 18th? Sorry, or do we not do anything at all? You just say, oh, well, that's it then. We let it run to Cabinet and we look at it afterwards. Those are the three options. After the 10th, just day or so afterwards, the 17th and verbal update back to Cabinet, or do we not do it and we run afterwards? I'm sure if the ward councillor for Chepstow was here, I'm sure she would have a strong view about having a meeting sometime before. But
my personal view would simply be I don't want to miss any windows, because timetables can slip so easily. We will have all had our timetable, our diaries noted for the 17th of September. Fundamentally, even if we discussed it and then simply only gave a verbal report to the Cabinet, at least we'd have our tuppence worth actually as an input. If then there was a subsequent decision to be made, or the circumstances as the result of the Cabinet meeting justified, then by all means perhaps we could call another CYP if it justified doing so. I just don't want to miss the boat on this particular thing. Things can slip very, very quickly, and it's quite difficult to reconvene a whole committee when we've already got one date in our diary. That's my feeling.
Maggie Harris, thanks for that. I think the question we've got to ask ourselves is, is there a point in if we go for an earlier meeting, is there a value in it? And I certainly don't want to call a meeting if people don't feel there's a value in it. But as I say, I keep going back to it. It is such an important issue in terms of the pupils, the staff, and for the authority. This is not a minor issue, and that's what I keep coming back to. Peter,
just asking really, would a verbal report really carry much less weight than a written one? I suspect not. In which case, given the points that have just been made, it might be better to leave it to the 17th, because there's a big chance that trying to do it on a different date means we'll have a small attendance, we'll be unrepresentative, and so on. But I think it's important that we do discuss it before the 18th, but also that we recognise it might well not be our last word on the matter.
Can I bring the scrutiny officer in, Hazel Eilert, please?
Yeah, just to confirm really what Peter suggested, the questions for you are, do you want to look at this? Is there any added value in you looking at it? And if you do want to have a meeting, we could do it on the 17th, and we just draft the chair's conclusion and give it to Will for the 18th. It's no big deal. This is not about whether we can get a report through to Will by the following day. It's just a paragraph of the committee's views. The question for you is there any added value in you looking at it? Do you want to look at it? And if so, when do you want to do it?
Councillor Martin Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I think many of us have already had chance to comment on the proposals through the governing bodies on which we sit, and certainly this committee has also discussed over time the emerging proposals for Mountain House. I wonder if meeting one day before Cabinet, whether we will actually introduce anything new that hasn't already been raised. And therefore, I would certainly go along with, yes, we need to let Cabinet know what this committee thinks, but I doubt that we would gain anything by changing the date, because at this point, I think all the relevant information will have been gathered in, and I would certainly be happy for that to be reported verbally by the Chief Officer and Scrutiny Manager.
Well, taking the feeling of the meeting, unless somebody else is going to speak against it, I get the feeling then that we agenda it for the 17th of September CYP meeting, which is in the book, as it were. It's in the diary. And I take your point, Peter, that if we try and change that date, it could mean then that we've got a sort of small nucleus group which isn't fully representative of CYP. So my thought would be we go with the 17th, and as the scrutiny officer suggested, there is a brief chair's report which then goes to Cabinet on the following day on the 18th. Are people happy with that? Yes? Okay, well, we'll go with that then. Any other issues now then on the forward work plan? Are people happy with this sort of, to a certain degree, broadening? I think certainly recapping on it, the issues of obviously not just the results, and as Will's outlined, the results this year will be totally different without the sort of cumulative charts, which I think is going to be a shock for a lot of people. And I think we need to think carefully about that. But are people generally happy with the suggestions that Will has put forward and I've put forward in terms of the forward work plan for this committee? Yeah, sorry.
So the next meeting then on the 17th of September, you want to have a discussion on the report just to give your view on Mountain House, but you've also got the corporate plan and the annual report of the Chief Officer. Now, you've also got budget monitoring on that, and I'm suggesting that that's probably too much. Something that we have talked about, or we've sort of discussed as officers, is the possibility of having a special meeting in September to discuss the corporate plan and the Chief Officer's report. You've already had Will's report, so it's not the education side, it's social services and Julie's side. So what we've discussed with the Chair of Adults is possibly having a joint meeting with adults, because the content is going to be applicable to both and to avoid duplication. So if that's the case, we could take that off the 17th. We can have a special meeting. We'll invite everybody, send out the invitations. It'll probably be earlier in September because it's due to go through to for decision later on. So does that sound okay?
People, to me, that sounds a good suggestion. It's too heavy as it is, and particularly Mountain House will probably take us some time to look at and discuss. So unless anybody's saying no, I think we go to the corporate report, goes earlier in September, and then we've just got the budget monitoring report on Mountain House as the main sort of guts of that meeting. People happy with that? Yeah. Thanks, Will. Thanks for coming.
Is it possible
Margie?
for us to have the earlier date in September ASAP so we can all diary it in?
I'll be asking Democratic Services to arrange that as soon as possible. I was just waiting to speak to this committee today because I've discussed it with the Chair of Adults. So yes, hopefully we'll get that diarised straight away.
Okay, well, thanks for that. We've been jumping on the agenda. I promise no more changes now. We'll go back now to agenda item 6, and we've got 2 sets of minutes to confirm. We've got the minutes of the 8th of May and the 21st of May. If we take the 8th of May first, people are happy with that? With the minutes accuracy? Yes? And then, thank you, and then the 21st of May? Yes? No issues? We move now then to item 7, actions arising from the previous meeting.
Chair, there's a list of actions here that date back for several meetings, but the ones that we are sort of alerting you to would be the 21st of May, which was the return of the new curriculum into the work programme, and also discussion on pioneer schools, and we've got that built into the programme we've just discussed.
Yes.
Okay.
Again, are people happy to accept that? So those are 2 things we obviously need to look at. 8 we've covered. 9, the Council and Cabinet Work Planner.
The work plan, just to update the new members really, the purpose of bringing the Cabinet Council and individual Cabinet member decision forward plan is so that any of the any members here could highlight something that they would like to bring forward for scrutiny, or they could ask to have sight of the report just to read it, understand it. It's got the report authors in there, so it's a forward plan for Cabinet, but it's to make sure that you don't miss anything that might be going forward for decision that you're interested in bringing forward. So it's on our agenda to note for information, but for you to suggest anything that you think we might have missed in terms of our own scrutiny.
Hazel, thanks. Okay, so we get to 10 to confirm the date and time of the next meeting is 17th of September, and obviously we will be looking at Mountain House on there, and we'll be looking at the budget out, and those will be the 2 sort of substantive agenda items for that meeting. Thank you very much for attending this morning, and thank you all for your inputs. And I think it's 11:45, and I've come to the end of the meeting. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.